Mr. Pretorius. Good morning, Mr. President.
Morning,
Good morning,
Chair.
everybody. Thank you. Mr. Pretorius, are you?
Yes, we're ready, Chair. The
Yes.
President will testify today and tomorrow. I will introduce the bundles in a moment. If the President could be sworn in, please.
Sorry?
If the President could be sworn in.
Oh, yes, no, that's fine. Before that is done, I just want to say a few things. Mr. President, we are happy that you are here representing the ruling party. We are happy that the president of the party is the one who comes to give evidence to the commission. But I also want to say that your appearance before this commission is not a result of a decision taken recently. It's a decision that was taken in 2018, as you will remember, because soon after the commission had started its hearings, I realized that the commission could not properly complete its task without the ruling party appearing before the commission, because the ruling party is the party that was given power by the voters to form the government. So it was important that the ruling party should appear before the commission and say what it knew about all sorts of allegations that have been had in this commission, when it knew it, and what it did about those things, and also to indicate what it is prepared to do to make sure that those things never happen again. I also realized that it would be important that the current president should appear, because during at least part of the time when these allegations, these things were alleged to have happened, it was a time when he was deputy president of the ANC and deputy president of the country, so that he could indicate also what he may have known and what he didn't know, and what was done to deal with, particularly allegations of state capture and the high levels of corruption that we have seen. So towards the end of 2018, I had a meeting with the president where I conveyed to him my view that it would be important that the ruling party appears before the commission, and that he or the executive should also appear to deal with these matters. And the president agreed that he would appear before the commission, and he indicated also that the ANC would appear. So I thought I must just remind everybody how it comes about that he appears today. It is not a recent decision. But I want to also take this opportunity to indicate, Mr. President, that the Commission appreciates the support for the work of the Commission that both you as President of the country and the ruling party has shown. So that is appreciated. Thank you. Mr. President, you will need to take the oath or affirmation, depending on what you will be taking. Which one would it be, Mr. President?
I will take the oath.
You will take the oath. Okay, may you please stand. I don't know whether you would like to take off your mask.
Is it safe to do so?
Well, if we can hear you with it on clearly, you can keep it on. But what has happened in the past is that usually we can't hear people clearly. But
It's okay.
if we can hear you and you'd like to keep it on, that would be fine. Please give your full names for the record, Mr. President.
My name is Matamela Cyril Ramaphosa.
Do you have any objection to taking the prescribed oath?
No, I do not have any objection.
Do you consider the oath binding on your conscience?
Yes, I do.
Do you swear that the evidence you will give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing else but the truth? If so, please raise your right hand and say, "So help me God."
So help me God.
Thank you. You may be seated. Yes, Mr. Pretorius.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. President, a few housekeeping matters. Before you is a bundle, bundle 1. And in that bundle is Exhibit BBB1, Statement of the President together with annexures. Then there is a second bundle, containing Exhibit BBB2, which is a collation of certain documents that are relevant to the evidence.
Mr. Pretorius, I just want to, I do see that there is social distancing between many people, but I think some can do with some more space, so we just need to make sure. There is a lot of space available in the room. Okay. Yeah, I see some are sitting next to each other, so. Well, just, we all know what the social distancing is. I'm just reminding everybody if there is social distancing between people, that's fine. Okay, you may proceed, Mr.
Thank you, Chair. So there are two bundles, as I've said, Bundle 1 and Bundle 2. Bundle 1 contains the statement of the President. Bundle 2 contains certain additional documentation. Bundle 2 has only been recently compiled, and I'll explain why in a moment.
Do I need it immediately?
No, you don't need it immediately, Chair.
Okay.
May I then ask, Mr. President, if you would take the first bundle. Do you have it?
Please switch on the mic, Mr. President. Yes.
Okay, permanently.
Yes. Mr. Pretorius, I think it would be convenient, it would be important before you start for the benefit of the public to explain what will be covered and what will not be covered with the President this time.
I had planned to do that next, Chair.
That's fine. That's fine.
Okay.
That's
and
fine,
I will do that in full.
Okay, all right.
At page 79, and we will refer to the black numbers in the top left-hand corner, is a page with a signature above your name. Would you please confirm that that is your signature? Page 79, black numbers in the top left-hand corner.
Yes, indeed, it is my signature.
And if you would go, please, to the same bundle at page 5, and particularly at page 6, is that the beginning of your affidavit?
Indeed.
And are you satisfied that the contents of that affidavit, insofar as you are aware, are true and correct?
Yes, they are correct.
Thank you. Chair, may the affidavit and annexures, and I see each page has been initialed, be admitted then as Exhibit BBB 1.
Is that triple B?
Triple B. We've been through the alphabet 3 times in this commission.
The affidavit of President Madamela Cyril Ramaphosa, which starts at page 6, will be admitted as an exhibit and will be marked as Exhibit triple B1.
Yes. And then, Mr. President, I believe that you wish to make an opening statement, but just before we do that, if I may place certain matters on record, Chair. There is a statement that we have just placed on record as an affidavit. It's attested to in your capacity as President of the ANC and former Deputy President of the ANC. Am I correct?
Yes, you are correct.
And there is a further statement that will be placed before the Commission dealing with matters in your capacity as President of the Republic and former Deputy President of the Republic, but that is yet to be obtained. Is that correct?
Yes, that is so.
Yes. We received your statement on the 22nd of April 2021, and we proceeded to undertake the necessary research. That process is not yet complete, and accordingly we may have to deal with certain issues on your return towards the end of May.
Indeed.
In these first 2 days of your evidence, Mr. President, we will deal with your terms as ANC Deputy President and President.
Yes, indeed.
And those facts or facts relevant to that are contained in your affidavit just admitted. I will deal with certain matters, and then Advocate Freund will deal with certain matters tomorrow. In the second 2 days, towards the end of the month, we will deal with matters related to your office as head of state, and there will be questions from the legal team, Advocate Selekis, Sony, and Myberg, in relation to that, as well as questions from myself. And that is just the background, I think, that the DCJ wanted placed on record.
Thank you. I will be here.
Thank you. Well, Mr. Pretorius, you have said that you will deal with other matters with the President towards the end of the month. Now, the public doesn't know towards the end of the month. They know mid-May.
Yes, I was leaving that to you, Chair. It's an announcement from the Chair.
Okay, let me say this about that, because Mr. Pretorius forgot that it was not public yet. It was something that I discussed with him. Mr. President, currently you are due to return to the Commission wearing your cap as President of the country in mid-May. I can't remember the exact dates, but mid-May. But I indicated to Mr. Pretorius that we'll have to advise your office that those dates will need to be moved towards later in May, because there are still a number of witnesses that the Commission would like to hear. And so that was something that was still to be done, but I don't know, Mr. Pretorius may have spoken to your team about it, but that is something that is in the pipeline. So you might also have been wondering why he was talking about towards the end of May. But so those dates will change, and will move you towards the end of May. Yes, thank you. You are done, Mr. Pretorius?
For the moment.
For the moment, obviously. Okay. Mr. President, if you wish to make an opening statement, this is the opportunity for you to do so.
Thank you, Chairperson, and thank you, Mr. Pretorius. I appear before this commission, as you have stated, Chairperson, at the request of the commission, but I also appear to assist the commission in its work, and I'd like to make this opening statement on behalf of the African National Congress. When I was confirming that I would be appearing, I happened to be talking to one of my colleagues who is also head of state. We had to attend to some matter, and I said I would be appearing before the commission. And his reaction was, how can you do that as head of state? I said, this is how our democracy works. It works in such a way that when there are important matters that affect the state and the government, and indeed the governing party, we will not shy away from appearing before commissions so that we may shed light on the matters that the commission is dealing with, and also be able to assist the commission in its mandate. So I appear here in my capacity as the President of the African National Congress, having been elected to this position in December of 2017 at the ANC's 54th conference. Yesterday, our country celebrated the 27th anniversary of the advent of democracy. On that day, we ushered in a new era, and as a nation, we made a decisive break with the horrible past of colonialism and apartheid. The ANC, working together with many anti-apartheid formations, led and facilitated the process of crafting a new constitutional dispensation that is today the bedrock of our democracy. This month marks 25 years since the first hearing of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission into apartheid-era human rights abuses. It was a remarkable moment in our history to hold that commission, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, demonstrating our determination as a nation to unearth and confront the crimes of our past so that we may make a decisive break with those violations of human rights and so that we may forge a better future for all our people. This Commission of Inquiry into allegations of state capture, corruption, and fraud in the public sector carries a similar responsibility. This Commission is the instrument through which we seek, as a nation, to understand the nature and extent of state capture, to confront it, to hold those responsible to account, and to take the necessary measures and steps to ensure that such events do not occur ever again in our country. State capture and corruption have taken a great toll on our society and indeed on our economy as well. They have eroded the values of our Constitution and undermined the rule of law. If followed, or rather, if allowed to continue, they would threaten the achievement of the growth, development, and transformation of our country. It is for these reasons that the ANC's 54th National Conference in December 2017 resolved to support the establishment of this commission. The ANC has consistently expressed its support for the objectives and the work of this commission. The National Executive Committee of the ANC has expressed itself in that regard, and we continue to do so. The ANC has taken this position knowing that the organization would itself be placed under great scrutiny, and that the process of examining these matters would very likely be difficult and painful for the ANC. Nevertheless, the ANC maintains that this commission is a necessary part of the broader social effort to end all forms of state capture and corruption. The ANC's position has been that it is the responsibility of ANC members, and indeed all South Africans, to assist the Commission in its work. Therefore, I appear before the Commission not to make excuses or to defend the indefensible. The ANC has agreed to not only support the work of the Commission, but to assist the Commission in every way possible to fulfill its mandate. My submission and other submissions made on the ANC's behalf by a number of my comrades and colleagues are therefore intended to provide whatever information, context, and explanation the Commission may require. Corruption is not a new phenomenon in South Africa. The apartheid system was morally and systematically corrupt. Not only did its legal provisions appropriate to a small minority the assets and the resources that rightfully belonged to all South Africa's people, but there was also a prevailing culture of corruption within the apartheid state, also within its state-owned enterprises, but it also went broader than that into private business establishments and the numerous Bantustan administrations that had been set up to balkanize our country. The advent of democracy in South Africa was an opportunity to make a decisive break with that past. Through the adoption of a new constitution, we established a new era of transparency, accountability, ethical conduct, and respect for the rule of law. The experience of the past 27 years shows that endeavor to have been, for the most part, successful. And its success can also be measured by the establishment of this commission, which is, in a very transparent and open manner, opening up the can of worms of corruption and state capture. Our country has a national parliament and provincial legislatures elected by universal suffrage in regular and free, fair elections. We are proud to have a strong and independent judiciary. Our democracy is supported by robust institutions, and we have a free and vibrant media. An important aspect of the ANC's approach to corruption over the years is a recognition of the extent to which some ANC leaders and members were advertently and inadvertently complicit in corrupt action. And this recognition was well articulated in our conferences, where we did say that we need to openly and publicly acknowledge that these are the problems that we have to deal with. And as a consequence, the extent to which corruption contributed to practices of patronage, factionalism, and the manipulation of organizational processes within the ANC is a matter of record. The recognition of these facts does not mean that the ANC is itself corrupt or uniquely affected by corruption. There are other institutions in society, various political and social formations, as well as the private sector companies that have to confront corruption within their own ranks. Nor is South Africa alone in the world in having to deal with endemic corruption. Many other countries have to deal with corruption in the political, economic, and social spheres. But it is clearly not sufficient for us to recognize the problem. The task of any organization like the African National Congress, especially with its history of principled struggle, its values, and its mission, is to address the problem. It should be noted that while there is broad consensus within South African society that a process of state capture took place over the course of several years, it took some time for the term state capture to gain currency and for the phenomenon it described to be clearly recognized as such. Therefore, even though some of the incidents that I refer to in my submission may be regarded as instances of state capture, they were not necessarily recognized or described as such at the time. And even as the term gained currency, there were individuals in the ANC and in society more broadly who contested both the use of the term and the existence of the phenomenon. In my submission, I outline how allegations of state capture arose within the structures of the ANC and how the organization responded at different moments. Without going into detail in this opening statement, it is worth mentioning that one of the earliest claims made within ANC structures of the possibility that members of the Gupta family may have had an improper role in the functioning of the executive was a statement by Minister Fikile Mbalula at an ANC meeting in 2011. To my knowledge, the matter was not taken further by the NEC or in any structure of the organization after he had mentioned it. At the time, the statement did not prompt any specific concerns about the capture of the state. With the passage of time, more reports began to surface in the public domain about the alleged capture of public enterprises by private interests and the undue influence of certain individuals, notably members of the Gupta family, in executive decisions and appointments. As the volume of evidence began to mount in the public domain, the issue of state capture, even if it was not described in those terms at the time, became increasingly a subject under discussion in the National Executive Committee of the ANC and ANC structures. It was also a matter taken up more directly by ANC's alliance partners, the South African Communist Party and the Congress of South African Trade Unions. It was also taken up by ANC veterans and other outside structures of the organization, including civil society formations, including religious organizations. Corruption is, by its nature a covert activity. Those who perpetrate corruption and related crimes generally seek to keep their actions hidden or masked and disguise their intentions. Without direct evidence, without any investigative capability and mandate, and in the face of vehement denials, it is difficult for any structure to confront such activity. In addition, the ability of any organization, but especially a political formation, to act on allegations of malfeasance relies not only on its formal rules and procedures, but also on the balance of power within its structures. The alignment of views within such an organization is further influenced by access to the offices of state, where the ability to appoint and to dismiss, and even to dispense patronage, is concentrated amongst a few individuals. For the ANC, this was compounded by its own subjective challenges. The ANC took time at its 54th National Conference to reflect on these subjective challenges and recognized the erosion of its organizational integrity as processes have been manipulated to advance the material interests of certain members and associated private companies and individuals. This manifested itself in weak and pliable branches of the ANC. It also manifested itself with vote buying and gatekeeping, factionalism, and open conflict. This provided fertile ground for state capture and corruption. As I outlined in my submission, Chairperson, the ANC has, over the course of several years, recognized the existence of corruption within the state, within its own ranks, and in other parts of society. It has taken a number of resolutions on measures to prevent corruption, including on issues relating to state capture. These are evident in the statements of the ANC National Executive Committee, particularly from 2016 onwards, which included a call for an independent investigation by competent authorities into these allegations. The question that arises is whether these resolutions and pronouncements were followed by meaningful action to fight corruption and end state capture. In answering this question, we must acknowledge that the issue of state capture was a matter of great political contestation within the ANC. Differences over whether indeed state capture existed, its extent and form, and what should be done about it contributed to divisions within the National Executive Committee and other ANC structures. These divisions were evident also in government, in parliament, and other sections of society. Indeed, the issue of state capture and corruption was prominent in the contestation that took place ahead of the ANC's 54th National Conference in December 2017. However, we would argue that over the course of time, through political debate and democratic contestation, the organization took active measures to confront state capture. This is evident, for example, in the events that unfolded in Parliament from late 2016 and into 2017, where the ANC and other parties initiated a number of inquiries into allegations of malfeasance in some state-owned enterprises and parts of government. It is clear from the affidavit submitted to the Commission by the former ANC Chief Whip, the late Mr. Jackson Mthembu, that the determination of the ANC in Parliament to probe these allegations was both a response to the evidence of wrongdoing that was accumulating in the public domain and the implementation of the decisions taken by the ANC's constitutional structure, especially its NEC. The ANC's 54th National Conference was in many ways a watershed moment in the ANC's effort to confront state capture and corruption within its ranks. Much of the discussion at the conference on the issues of state capture was framed by a diagnostic organizational report presented by the then Secretary General, Gwede Mantashe, on behalf of the National Executive Committee. This report directly addressed the allegations of corruption and the involvement of ANC members and leaders in the broader context of state capture. The conference consequently resolved to demand that every ANC member accused of or reported to be involved in corrupt practices should account to the Integrity Commission immediately or face disciplinary process. It also resolved to summarily suspend people who fail to give an unacceptable explanation or to voluntarily step down while they face disciplinary, investigative, or prosecutorial procedures. It also resolved to publicly disassociate the organization from anyone, whether business, donor, supporter, or member, accused of corruption or reported to be involved in corruption. It further resolved to ensure that ANC members and structures cooperate with law enforcement agencies to criminally prosecute anyone guilty of corruption. And further, it said it requires the ANC deployees to cabinet, that is national cabinet, especially the Minister of Finance, Minister of Police, Justice, and Correctional Services to strengthen state capacity to successfully investigate and prosecute corruption and account for any failure to do so. Now, these resolutions, in more ways than one, signaled a clear determination by the membership of the African National Congress to acknowledge the organization's failing, to make also a clean break with corrupt practices, and to initiate an ethical, political, and organizational renewal of the ANC. Now, following the 54th National Conference and in line with its resolution, the ANC embarked upon a process of organizational rebuilding and renewal. This included corrective measures both within the ANC and indeed the state, while the latter are dealt with more extensively in my statement to the Commission, the capacity as head of state which would be presented. It is important to note that these measures were informed and inspired by the mandate of the ANC's National Conference, which, as you might be aware, is attended by thousands of members from ANC branches across South Africa. One of the areas in which the ANC has taken clear action is to require that members of the ANC who are formally charged with corruption and other serious charges must immediately step aside from all leadership positions in the ANC, legislatures or government structures, pending the finalization of their matters. Such members who do not step aside may be summarily suspended. Furthermore, members of the ANC who are reported to be involved in corrupt and other criminal practices must go to the ANC's Integrity Commission and provide a credible explanation for these allegations or reports. Should members fail to give an acceptable explanation, they may be suspended or subjected to disciplinary process. In line with the ANC Constitution, ANC members who are convicted of corruption or other serious crimes must resign from leadership positions and face disciplinary action. It is worth mentioning that some of these requirements, especially on the so-called step-aside provision, have in the past been the subject of much contestation within the organization. However, there is now broad support within the organization for its implementation. At its most recent meeting on the 26th to the 29th of March, the NEC directed that all members who have been charged with corruption or other serious crimes must step aside within 30 days, failing which they should be suspended in terms of Rule 25.70 of the ANC's Constitution. The ANC has embarked on a process of renewal and rebuilding to build a movement characterized by integrity, accountability, and the highest standards of ethical behavior. Now, the process of renewal is by itself a process. It's not a one-day event, and it's a process that is ongoing. The rate of progress is determined not only by the existence of political will and organizational capacity, but also by the continued existence of vested interest and resistance from those who have much to lose from the corrective measures mandated by the ANC's 54th National Conference. I will now turn to some specific issues that the Commission has asked me to address. The first of these is the ANC's approach to cadre development and deployment. This issue has been covered in some detail by the ANC National Chairperson, Mr. Gwede Mantashe. In his testimony before the Commission, Mr. Mantashe described the evolution and the development of the ANC's policies, the principles that have informed this approach, and the structures and processes that the ANC has put in place to manage cadre development and deployment. Since even before the advent of democracy, the ANC has said that in transforming the public service to reflect the values of our democracy and the demographics, or better still, the diversity of our country, we must emphasize professionalism and competence. This is reflected in our earliest policy pronouncement, which were part of the Ready to Govern document, which was released in 1991, as the ANC was preparing to enter government, knowing that the level of support that it had would give it a mandate to do so. But it was also confirmed at the 54th National Conference. The ANC fully embraces the principle that all public servants should undertake their duties in a fair, balanced, and non-partisan manner. It should be noted that the deployment of cadres to strategic positions is not unique to the ANC. it is practiced in various forms and through various mechanisms, even if not always acknowledged as such, by other political parties in our own country and also in other countries. In our view, cadre development has acquired such prominence in part because of the perspective that there should not be political interference in the selection of people who work in the public sector. However, international practice suggests a more nuanced approach to this matter. For example, an OECD working paper on public governance published in 2007, written by a number of scholars, including one called Murchison, said that with specific reference to appointments of senior public service staff, open quotes, political involvement in administration is essential for the proper functioning of a democracy. However, public services need protection against being misused for partisan purposes. They need technical capacity, which survives changes of government, and they need protection against being used to impair the capacity of future governments to govern, close quote. In identifying suitable candidates for positions in public entities, the ANC does not seek to circumvent the established and often legally mandated processes for the appointment of individuals to these positions. Candidates are expected to submit their applications, meet the necessary requirements, and be subjected to the normal processes of recruitment, selection, and appointment. Even with these requirements, there are several instances where individuals appointed to positions may not have been fit for purpose or may not have had the necessary experience or qualification. And this much I'm prepared to admit. The ANC 54th National Conference recognized this problem and resolved that the merit principle must apply in the deployment to senior appointments based on legislated prescripts and in line with minimum competency standards. It is the ANC's view that the practice of cadre development should not be inconsistent with the principles of fairness, transparency, and merit in the appointment of individuals to public entities. Cadre deployment cannot be faulted in principle. It is a common feature of democratic practice around the world. And I think if properly described and is not diluted through various other intents and forms, it is a useful process used by governing parties around the world to make sure that the mandate that they have been given by the populace is carried out. But we would concede that there are weaknesses in its practical implementation that make the case for greater clarity, both within political parties and the state. Ultimately, political involvement in the administration of the public service should be and must be circumscribed by legislation, by convention, as well as by practice. And we should do so to protect both political and administrative positions and to create certainty as to the division between political and administrative responsibility. There are a number of governments around the world who utilize this very mechanism, as outlined in the OECD paper. The Commission also asked that I address the funding of political parties. Any successful multi-party democracy requires a diversity of functioning political parties that are capable of articulating and representing the needs, the interests, and the concerns of the electorate. For this, political parties require funding. And in the absence of sufficient public funds for this purpose, need to rely on donations from their own members, from supportive individuals, and yes, indeed, from businesses. Until the adoption of the Political Party Funding Act, which took effect from the 1st of April 2021, there were few, if any, specific restrictions on donations to political parties and no requirements on the reporting of donations, either publicly or to any particular authority. Like other parties, the ANC relies on several sources of funding. Many treasurer generals who run the financial affairs of various political parties will testify that the running of political parties has become increasingly costly, expensive, and requires a lot of funding. These include funds allocated to represented political parties, which are administered by the IEC, membership subscriptions, as well as levies that are levied on members who are deployed either in Parliament or various places, fundraising initiatives like, in the ANC's case, the Progressive Business Forum, funding dinners and other events, and donations from individuals and companies. Despite the absence of any official policy on donations, there is an expectation based on the ANC Constitution, its principles and its values, that the ANC would not knowingly accept monies that are a product of a criminal act, are offered in exchange for favors, or are from a source known to engage in illegal or unethical activity. The ANC has long recognized the risk presented by the lack of regulation with respect to political funding, political party funding. The lack of transparency in donations to political parties increases the potential for corruption and the exercise of improper influence on political activity and government processes. It was to address this problem that the ANC resolved at its 52nd conference that, open quotes, the ANC should champion the introduction of a comprehensive system of public funding of representative political parties in the different spheres of government and civil society organizations. This should include putting in place an effective regulatory architecture for private funding of political parties and civil society groups to enhance accountability and transparency to the citizenry, close quote. It was not until the next ANC conference in December 2012 that the political party funding bill was introduced into Parliament to achieve this purpose. We believe that the Political Funding Act will have a far-reaching implication for the integrity and transparency of our political system and will help to rebuild public trust in the political process. While the Political Party Funding Act deals with donations to political parties, the ANC has also identified weaknesses in its approach to the funding of internal party contests, that is, leadership contests. Specifically, it has noted that its guidelines on the conduct of internal leadership elections are not suited for the conditions of the time that we live in and has initiated a process to review its policies on this matter. The issue forms part of the discussion documents published last year in preparation for the ANC's upcoming National General Council. In raising this issue during the NEC meeting of 26 July 1919, I said, as president, open quotes, in the absence of clear, appropriate, and realistic guidelines, our leadership contests will continue to play themselves out in the shadows, in conditions of secrecy and mistrust, encouraging patronage and factionalism, close quote. In conclusion, the position of the ANC on leaders and members who have been complicit in acts of corruption or other crimes is clear. Their actions are a direct violation not only of the laws of the Republic, but also of the ANC Constitution, its values and principles, and the resolutions and decisions of the ANC's constitutional structure. Such members must face the full legal consequences of their actions. They cannot rely on the ANC for support or protection, nor may they appeal to the principle of collective responsibility. In accounting for their actions, they must be accountable for their actions themselves, because the ANC did not and could never direct its members or leaders to commit acts of corruption. While the ANC distances itself from those within its ranks who have been involved in corruption or who are complicit in state capture, the organization must and does acknowledge that it must provide explanations for the matters currently under investigation by the Commission. We should do so because state capture took place under our watch as the governing party. It involved some members and leaders of our organization, and it found fertile ground in the divisions, in the weaknesses, and the tendencies that have developed in our organization since 1994. I should say, however, that the vast majority of ANC leaders, ANC cadres, and ANC members are vehemently opposed to corruption in all its manifestations. But we all acknowledge that the organization could and should have done more to prevent the abuse of power and the misappropriation of resources that defined the era of state capture. Particularly during the period under review by this commission, the ANC does admit that it did make mistakes, as we have admitted in our various conferences. Made mistakes as it sought to execute the mandate that it was given by the voters. It had shortcomings in living up to the expectations of the people of South Africa in relation to enforcing accountability and engendering a culture of effective consequence management. As the leadership of the ANC, duly elected at its 54th conference, we acknowledge these shortcomings as an organization, and we did acknowledge that at our 54th National Conference, and we do so now. For this, we acknowledge to the people of South Africa that we did not always live up to the values and principles that have defined the glorious movement that we belong to for over more than a century of its existence. We are, however, determined, and we undertake to work alongside all South Africans to ensure that the era of state capture is relegated to history and that the excesses that took place may never, 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 ever occur in our country. I thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you, Mr. President. We are at 9 minutes past 11. We normally take an adjournment at 11:15. I think we should take an adjournment now so that when we resume, then we can continue. We are going to take the adjournment now. We will resume at 11:25.
Thank you,
We
Chair.
adjourn.
President. By way of introduction, it appears from your statement and your opening statement, in addition to public statements, that there are indeed three issues that the Commission should properly investigate. The first is to understand what happened in the period under review. And we have 3 years of evidence before the Commission, and we have certain statements in the opening and in your general statement in that regard. But the second is perhaps more important for present purposes, and that is to understand how these things could have happened. And it is in that regard that many of the questions will be put before you, Mr. President. In other words, what were the circumstances and events that allowed these things to happen, which appears by public consensus, as you say, to have been conceded to have happened? And the third element that is also very important, that may have to stand over to a large extent to the second session of your evidence, is how can these things be prevented from happening again? So we will cover all three issues, but concentrate principally on issues 2 and 3. Of course, we will also ask of questions of what you knew was happening in terms of or in relation to the terms of reference. And in relation to the third question, we will also ask what you as President, the ANC, and the executive which you are leading are doing or intend doing or think should be done to prevent it happening again. And many of those elements are already in progress. For example, matters in relation to law enforcement agencies, the Political Party Funding Act, and others. But there are other questions that will arise out of that. And the object will be to ask on your part for evidence that will allow the Commission and the Chair in particular to understand what best are the remedies that can recommend. But having said that, by way of introduction, Mr. President, there is a unique element to this evidence. This is your Commission. This Commission is reporting to you, and in that sense, it is a unique situation. But notwithstanding, we hope that you will help us do our job for you properly.
Of course, it is a presidential commission in his capacity as president of the country, not as president of the ANC.
Yes, well, that's also true, Chair. So maybe I should reserve that question for the next session. Mr. President, what we have done in response to your statement is look at certain paragraphs in the statement and to deal with matters arising from those paragraphs, and in particular your statements in those paragraphs. But if we leave anything out in the sequence, please alert us to it so that we can then go back and everything can be taken in its proper sequence. So the first issue that we do have to raise is on page 12 of Bundle 1, Exhibit BBB1. But if there's anything before that, you no doubt will alert us to it. This is the introductory portion of your statement.
I'm sorry, Mr. President, you said page 12?
Page 12.
You explained to the President the black numbers and red numbers?
Yes. We will be dealing, there are two sets of numbers on each page. we will be dealing with the numbers at the top left-hand corner. And we've taken the liberty of using the acronym CR there.
My page 12, Mr. Pretoria, starts with "in the course of this commission's
Yes.
work." Is that the right page?
Yes.
Is that the right page?
Yes.
Okay.
In paragraph 21 on that page, Mr. President, you say, "In such circumstances, political parties do not merely represent their members, but often act as instruments to advance the needs and interests of entire sections of society. This is among the reasons that the ANC describes itself as a liberation movement. First and foremost, that, among things, contests elections as a registered political party." I understand from this paragraph, as well as parts of your opening statement, that the party sees itself, in terms of liberation, constitutional policies and principles, the development of the South African society in accordance with these principles, as a leader in society. There can be no doubt about that fact. And as I understand it, that would be the justification that the party holds for adopting the stance that it is entitled to and does seek to control the levers of power. Do you have any comment on that? Is that common cause?
With reference that you make to paragraph 21, indeed, ANC characterizes itself as a liberation movement, which we really have been from formation, and largely because we were set up to achieve certain objectives. And those objectives remain current to be executed. And you could say, in part, some of them have been, like we now have a democratic dispensation, but we still want to pursue a truly non-racial South Africa. That has not yet been truly achieved. We're also a liberation movement because we seek also to attain a non-sexist South Africa. Sexism is still rife in our country, and it's also compounded by the continued violence that is perpetrated against women. But more importantly, also to attain a prosperous South Africa. That is an overarching objective. And that remains what the ANC has as its objective, that characterizes it as a liberation movement. But in the midst of all this, it still has to be a political party that contests elections. And in doing so, it then is supported by millions and millions of South Africans. So when it acts, it needs to fulfill the mandate that it has set itself out to achieve, which is informed by the ordinary people who elect it. Because as we craft our manifestos, we don't do it just merely for ourselves as a party. We go out and gather the views and the aspirations of ordinary people. And therefore, when we are then elected, we represent the people of South Africa. And it is for this reason that we say, we hold power not just for ourselves. We hold power and execute power, exercise rather power, in the interests of the people of South Africa. The many millions who elect us, and it is for this reason that we say, and it's been conceded, that we are a leader of society, and what the ANC does and says quite often determines the mood in the country, it determines the direction that the country should go. So it's a role that is given to the African National Congress by the majority of the people of this country. And they expect the ANC to act in a way where it will lead government and it will lead transformation and achieve the objectives as set out by itself as a liberation movement.
Thank you, Mr. President. It may seem what you've said should be taken for granted, but perhaps it shouldn't be taken for granted. There are two things that flow from that statement, particularly the latter part of your statement, that there is an expectation on the part of South Africans that the party will lead in dealing with policy, problems, solutions, and the like. And we'll come back to that point later. But the second is that the electorate would then be entitled to know how and what, how the ANC intends to go about its business and business of the country, the people, and what it is doing in that regard. That's a fair statement. Obviously, there are exceptions, but
I would concede that, yes, they are entitled. And in other ways, we also describe ourselves as the ANC, as the parliament of the people. And when the ANC was formed in 1912, we, the leaders of past, then characterized even that moment as the creation of the parliament of the people, because the people as a whole, the majority, were excluded from the parliament, the so-called parliament that existed then. So yes, people are entitled to know. And that is why the ANC, for the most part, has been one of the very few parties in the country that has been willing and prepared to open, as it were, its chest, its heart to the people of South Africa and admit its own mistakes, and also set out the ways it seeks to correct, much as sometimes, because it's a political movement, there will be contestation on some of the issues.
You may keep your mic on,
Okay,
Mr. President.
I will do so.
Yeah.
then, Mr. President, after certain introductory structural remarks concerning the ANC's structures and processes, you deal with cadre or cadre development and deployment beginning at page 15. And in paragraph, well, perhaps I should presage that with a summary of the evidence, a very, very broad and perhaps superficial, but if it is superficial, you'll tell me, summary of the evidence in relation to cadre development and quote-unquote cadre deployment. On the one hand, there has been evidence that the policy goes far beyond mere recommendation and, in fact, is a policy implemented on the instruction and mandate of the deployment committee. That's one view, and there's certain evidence in regard to that. Whether that's exceptional or the rule, maybe we can deal with in due course when we come to detail. The other view, which is reflected in your statement and other statements, Mr. President, is that the deployment committee goes no further than make recommendations and abides by the formal selection processes that take place, for example, in the public service. Those are the two extreme views, and whether either is correct or not, Chair will have to consider and decide. Or it may be that neither is correct as a general rule, and that there is quite a large grey area between. What would your comment be?
The deployment committee, as I said in my statement in chief, should really be seen as a committee that recommends, a recommendation committee. And having been the chair of the deployment committee as deputy president, the process that really gets underway is as follows, and maybe I'm simplifying it. The minister concerned, for instance, that when it comes to, say, state-owned enterprises or state entities, would come forward and say, I need to appoint the CEO of one of the key state-owned enterprises. And in doing so, they will then have that post advertised, as they should in terms of the regulations and corporate governance and so forth. And a message will then be forwarded to, yes, the ANC Deployment Committee, that there is a position that the minister will come to the Deployment Committee with to articulate what position they need to fill. But then they will have triggered the process of the formal process of filling that position. So the advert then goes out so that whomsoever applies. But then internally in the ANC, people will then be encouraged to apply, that there is this position. If you qualify, you could be one of those who are either shortlisted or whatever. Then the minister will then say, we've shortlisted a number of people, and in the shortlisting, these are the people who have been shortlisted. Some of them may not even be ANC members. Some of them may well be ANC members. And what is then looked at by the deployment committee is to say, we really need someone with experience. For instance, if it's a railway entity of railways, and who has been well trained and well prepared and all that. And having done that, the deployment committee could well say, well, in our view, so-and-so fits the bill. It could be ANC person, it could be a non-ANC person, completely unattached to the ANC, that we believe that this person can do the work. And then it goes off to the final selection process that the minister then gets involved in with her colleagues in cabinet. Because an interviewing panel then is put up, and if it's, for instance, a director general, it happens in cabinet. If it's a state-owned enterprise, it happens in terms of company rules and what have you. So that then ensues. And then at times, chairperson, the desires of the deployment committee are not even fulfilled. They may well have said, we want so-and-so, and it may not happen. And we say that should be in terms of the prescripts of the law, corporate governance, and the prescripts of the selection process in, for instance, in the public service. So having chaired the deployment committee, I know that for a fact that in some cases the deployment committee wishes may not happen. So it is for that reason that I describe in the main the deployment committee as a recommendation committee. And it takes into account a whole number of considerations. You could ask, are some of them political? Yes, for key positions where we seek to advance the mandate of the governing party, yes. But where, for instance, the requirements and the experience of a candidate override that, we then say, we rely on this person as a South African to execute the task.
Whether it always happens that way or not, we can explore in due course with some of the more detailed evidence that we've been given. But I understand you to have said that the whole process does require some form of statutory or other regulation, and we can explore that issue as well in due course. But for the moment, in paragraph 25 on page 15, your statement reads, "The policy of the ANC is aimed at ensuring that the person most fit for purpose is appointed, whatever critical position has been identified." And the statement is quite a strong statement. In other words, the object of the policy is to ensure, not merely to suggest, that the person most fit for purpose is appointed to a particular position. You've also now recently said that the deployment committee goes out to seek candidates. How does one ensure that a person most fit for purpose is appointed if it's only a recommendation and another body makes the decision?
The process of selection of, let me put it, deployment of people has evolved, has been evolving, and has been a subject of discussion even in our past conference. And in recent time, the last conference, the issue of professionalizing the civil service, professionalizing state-owned enterprises, and getting people who are fit for purpose has become accepted and has become more current. And as it has evolved from a past that did not necessarily subscribe to that. So as everything evolves, as everything improves and gets better, this is now where we are. And to this effect, even the Minister of Public Service has now embraced this process, and it's now in the process of being fully implemented in government. So we now have a new era, a new dispensation that is going to see to it that we have people who are fit for purpose. So what the deployment committee will now need to be doing is to, yes, seriously ask itself whether people are fit for purpose, even as it will recommend certain people who could head any state-owned enterprise or head any department as DG. It has to use this as a filter and ask itself, is that person fit for purpose as it recommends? So I don't see the two things as mutually exclusive. I see this process as being seamless. Chairperson, we do so because we are serious about correcting what has gone wrong in the past. And this is an important plank that we are working on to make sure that we build this up as an important pillar of improving state capability. So when I will speak as head of the state, I will talk about how we are going about improving state capability, and this is one of the areas that I will address myself.
I'm sorry, Mr. President. What is the importance, Mr. President, of this deployment committee having the power to recommend as opposed to simply identifying potential candidates and encouraging them to apply like everybody and be considered, and if they are considered the most deserving, they get appointed? So what is the importance of the committee having to recommend as opposed to simply saying, we know there's this position available, we would like some of our members that we know are qualified and we think are suitable, or, as you say, people in society that the organization is aware of, that things should be encouraged, encourage them to say, you apply and you compete with everybody. So if you do it that way, the people that the deployment committee thinks are appropriate will be among those who will be considered. But they won't be coming with a recommendation from the deployment committee that the minister knows about. They'll be coming like everybody. But the deployment committee and the organization should be covered because it has made sure that people that it thinks should take those positions are there with others and competing fairly.
With respect, the chairperson, I hope you don't think that I'm being pedantic when I say maybe the two are not mutually exclusive.
Yes.
And I say so advisedly because as previous chair of the deployment committee, we did have some situations where the deployment committee will have identified 2 or 3 really suitable candidates and would say all of them, their names should go forward. And in the end, the final decision is then left to the final selection process in government. So what you are saying is that could the deployment committee not just identify instead of recommending? I would say the two are not mutually exclusive. It's been possible where all 2 or 3 names have been sent forward, and in other situations, it's been a recommendation of 1 or so. So, and I take that, and it's not impossible for the deployment committee to function in that way, because all that it really seeks to do and should seek to do is to get whoever is fit for purpose, particularly now in this new, if you like, reformed era of making sure that we do have people who are really good and fit for purpose, who will be able to execute the task at hand without feeling that they need to pursue and advance certain side interests. Yes.
Well, that question arises in my mind because it would seem to me that where a minister is the authority, is the appointing authority, for example,
Yes.
and he or she knows that among the candidates, there is this candidate who enjoys the recommendation of the deployment committee. And remember, the deployment committee is chaired by the deputy president of the, of the party and the deputy president of the country, because that's how it works at the moment. It seems to me that it might put some pressure on the minister to take this candidate unless one of the other candidates really excels. So in other words, this candidate seems to come with an advantage that nobody else knows about other than the deployment committee and the minister. So the other candidates think we are all competing on an equal footing, but this one already enjoys a recommendation from the deployment committee. Of course, a recommendation that has been made by the deployment committee, not knowing the strengths and credentials of other possible candidates. And then the minister is aware. A committee chaired by the deputy president thinks this is the person should, or recommends that this person should be appointed. Do you want to say something about that?
I do indeed.
Yes.
I do want to say something, Chairperson, and I will paint to you the practical experience that unfolds at the deployment committee. And it's good that you actually cite the situation of a minister who will come to the deployment committee. Quite often, ministers come to the deployment committee having gone through a process, a pre-selection process themselves, And there are various either officials or committees embedded in their own ministry, where they sift through a number of, say, possible names. And when they come, they seek to convince the deployment committee about certain candidates who may be shortlisted. So in the end, quite often, it's not even at the instance of the deployment committee. It is at the instance of the minister, who knows and should know the skills, the experience that are fit for purpose for the task that they manage or they run in the ministry. So they would know, for instance, CEO of an entity, what the requirements are. So and the deployment committee does not know in full. So they come to the deployment committee and seek to convince the deployment committee and even put up a pitted, not fight, but argumentation of why the persons that they may want to see appointed should be recommended by the deployment committee. So that is the practical experience that I've had. So the deployment committee, in the end, it will tell people that apply, there are these positions, but it is the deployee in that ministry or in that, who manages that state-owned enterprise, who would know in greater detail and finer detail precisely what is required. So they seek to convince the deployment committee. So if you like, the deployment committee therefore plays a recommendation role, but it also plays more of a reactive type of role. You could ask, is there any desirability for the deployment committee? And we would say, yes, there is, because it should serve as a filter. We're a political organization, and what we do in government is very political. So you do need that political filter, but it should also not be a political filter that will go ahead and appoint people who are not fit for purpose. It should be a filter that will make sure, and if you like, it should be a quality type of assurance that in the larger scheme of things, we are going to have people in senior positions who are going to execute the mandate as set out in the manifesto of the governing party.
Now, the two approaches you said, they are not mutually exclusive.
Yeah.
And I agree. I've already indicated what possible criticism can be directed at the approach as you have described it.
Yeah.
Namely, that the candidate recommended by the deployment committee has this added advantage. And I assume that it's not known to anybody other than the deployment committee and the appointing authority, the minister. I may be wrong on that. What criticism would you have with the other approach, which simply says your interest as an organization in making sure that that certain strategic positions are occupied by people who understand your policies and so on and so on, that would be taken care of if you encourage candidates, suitably qualified candidates, to apply. But once they have applied, why don't you leave it to the process and the appointing authority? And the appointing authority is your own cadre who is supposed to understand the policies of the ANC, and he or she will then look at all of these. But in that way, the candidate doesn't come with some extra added advantage. Would you have criticism for that approach and say it would not be suitable?
No, I wouldn't, except that what often happens, it is actually the minister
Who comes to you?
who comes and say, I am recommending the following, and the deployment committee then examines that, and it is often convinced.
About the ministers.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
And I've been in situations where the minister would come back maybe 2 to 3 times and say,
I want this one.
this is the best one, and I want to convince you and even bring further documentation to prove the case.
Yes.
And then I'm not suggesting that the minister browbeats the deployment committee into submission, but that's how it often happens. But having said that, your point is a good one, and I would say yes, because I don't really see the two being so mutually exclusive, particularly because of the role that the minister does play.
Yes, yes.
As the minister should, because they are the executive authority who has been deployed to do precisely that.
Mr. Pretorius?
Thank you, Chair. Perhaps it bears mention, Mr. President, that there are 3 issues that we will canvass in the time allowed. The first issue is, as you've elaborated in some detail, how is the system designed to work? How should it work? The second issue is how, whether in part, to a greater or lesser degree, that may be debatable, how it did work in the past. What problems arose? You've mentioned some problems, and we'll come to it in a moment, so that one can understand how best the third issue can be addressed, and that is the regulation that you yourself have proposed in your statement towards the end, and we'll get there. There's another distinction that is quite important to bear in mind, and that is there are various categories of quote-unquote deployment. The first is executive positions, for example, ministers, deputy ministers, and the like. The second is members of public service, DGs and employees employed in the public service at whatever level, and we'll come to that as well. And the third is state institutions, the Chapter 9 institutions, other appointments, whether at the hands of Parliament or the President or otherwise. So perhaps we should be aware of those distinctions when, well, I certainly will try and be aware of them when I'm putting questions to you about that. The deployment policy of the ANC is, I presume, a developing document. It's contained in your bundle at page 122.
Did you say 182, Mr. Pretorius?
Para 122.
Paragraph 122.
No, page 122.
Page 122. Got that.
Is this the deployment policy of the ANC?
Yes.
And does it have a date, or is it a developing document? Has it grown over time? I see if you look at page 138, there's a reference to 2018 in paragraph 67.
Yes. It's what I would call a living document. Living because as the ANC develops its own policies and polishes those policies up, so are these types of policies also being panel beated into better shape, if I can put it colloquially in that way.
That point we can deal with perhaps at the end in more detail, Mr. President, but if I could ask you please to go to page 105. This is a different document. This is the ANC Constitution.
Yes.
What page, Mr. President?
105.
105.
Thank you.
To paragraph or clause 25.17.20. This is the ANC Constitution. Take it, that's how it's identified in your statement.
Yes.
This is, paragraph 25.17 appears on the face of it to be a list of acts of misconduct which would apply to members of the ANC for which disciplinary proceedings, or in respect of which disciplinary proceedings may be instituted. 25.17.20 says, in the case of a public representative breaching his or her contract of deployment concluded with the NEC, does that creature still exist? Contract of employment with the NEC? Or please tell us about it.
Yeah. This presupposes a public representative, an elected public representative. Public representatives are ostensibly supposed to have a contract with the NEC. When I was Secretary General, and I think even during the tenure of the subsequent Secretary General, we presumed a situation where a public representative would literally accept their deployment as a public representative and sign a contract with the NEC, in the end, with the Secretary General, where they say, I accept my deployment, so that where it comes to a point where they have to be either removed, it's a termination of contract. Because in the past we faced a situation where some would say, I've been elected and I'm not stepping down or whatever. I'm not agreeing to being removed. So it deals more with publicly elected representatives and not so much with, say, appointees who would be governed by other provisions, which has to do with the appointment either in the civil service or in terms of company laws in the public enterprise.
Understood. Would the contract of employment have any substantive provisions setting out the duties of the public representative?
Yes, ostensibly it's supposed to have that. And I was also involved in the preparation and the drafting thereof in the past, and I have not really kept abreast with the continuity of such. And I would say that if it hasn't continued, it is a very good instrument to have, because it helps to regulate the relationship in the end between the organization and the person who is deployed. And this would also apply to a president, where the president has a contract with their organization, because even as president and minister, whoever you are, in the end deployed by the organization, because we have that type of political system.
Would it be fair to say, or would you accept that the electorate which elects the person to public office would be entitled to know by what contractual provisions their representative is bound?
Absolutely, I would say yes. Just as right now we've even published, as you might well know, at government level, and we can deal with that when I come as President of the Republic, published the contracts I've entered into with the minister. Performance contract.
Well, in passing, I must just say, Mr. President, that the Commission has struggled a lot to get previous performance contracts of ministers. To the best of my recollection, we got documents which reflected how they were supposed to look like. And I'm not sure that we ever got the ones that were actually signed, but maybe some unit of the Commission has, because we wanted them at a certain stage, starting from 2010 or 2009. And the information I was given at some stage looks like nobody knows where those contracts are. But maybe they have been found, I'm not sure. But it would be good if the ones that have been signed are kept properly, if the public or a commission like this wants them, they can get them.
Chairperson, I undertake when I come before you again, I undertake to bring a box full of them.
I also hope, Mr. President, in the box will be included performance assessments of ministers during that time.
We are in the course of doing performance assessments now.
Now, yeah.
Yes,
yeah.
so you may find a very incomplete process.
Okay,
including
right.
presidents.
Including presidents, yes.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll ask the chairperson to assess.
Okay, Mr. Pretorius.
May I ask you to go back to the deployment policy at page 124?
Yes.
Paragraph 9 of the deployment policy says, our immediate goal as set out in strategy and tactics is to deepen the hold of the liberation movement over the levers of state and begin to impact positively on other centers of authority and responsibility outside the immediate realm of state institutions. Can you assist? What are those other centers of authority and responsibility?
This, put simply, is a political speak about the ANC exercising its leadership role in society. That the more we perform well in the state, that will have a cascading impact on a whole number of other institutions, be it whatever is your sporting bodies and all that, and we will all start working in a harmonious way. And with the ANC infusing this very positive developmental approach to how we should develop the country going forward. So that is what is envisaged here. It's more political.
It does talk about positive impact
Precisely.
rather than direct control.
Yeah, positive impact, which is the leadership of society.
Right. And then in paragraph 10, the policy reads, the following are the key centers of authority and responsibility and should be given priority. 10.2, the entire civil service, but most importantly from director level upwards. And 10.3, Premier and provincial administration. It goes on to legislatures, local government, parastatals, education institutions, independent statutory commissions, agencies, boards and institutes, ambassadorial appointments, and international organizations and institutions. That list from 10.1 to 10.10, does that entire list fall within the scope of activity for the deployment committee, or is that list, should it be differently?
Well, for the most part, yes, it does. But I say for the most part advisedly, because in some instances, the deployment committee never really gets involved or concerns itself with this. If you like, the deployment committee has set itself its own limit, that we will only limit ourselves in terms of how we function or recommend people to these key positions. For instance, the deployment committee does not get involved in the appointment of ministers to cabinet. That is left to the president. But the president does consult his immediate colleagues, which are the officials of the ANC. But in the end, in terms of the governance system we have, it is the decision of the president and the president alone. So the deployment committee does not get involved in that. When it comes to the entire civil service, that has to be read to mean the top leadership of the civil service. Because it could never, it's not possible for the deployment committee to involve itself in the appointment of secretaries or directors and so forth. But it does, however, get involved in the appointment of directors general, and to some limited extent to also deputy directors general. But for the most part, the civil service appointments are done within the civil service itself, and in the end, even the minister does not also get involved in the appointment of the directors. It is the director general who gets involved in that. Of course, with premiers, yes, it is the deployment committee. Provincial administrations, hardly ever. The positions of DG of the provincial administration is done at the provincial level. The legislatures, there is a process of, if you like, deploying people to our legislatures as well, the national parliament and provincial and local, which really does not even, the deployment committee does not really get involved with that, because that's more of a very rigorous and robust democratic process that is involved there. Local government, and I explained somewhere in my affidavit, something quite innovative has now been done as this has evolved in the ANC, where it is no longer only the branches, the branch committees, it's also the community that gets involved in the final selection of people who should go into local government. Parastatals, yes, the key top positions. Education institutions, hardly ever. The employment committee, like with cabinet, hardly ever gets involved. Independent institutions, only to the extent of your top key ones. And for instance, you'll be interested to know that when it comes to the judiciary, it is left to that process that we have in the law. Ambassadorial appointments, those will be recommended, and they are always often recommended by the minister. The minister, and in the end, because ambassadorial appointments are at the instance of the president. It is the president who appoints ambassadors because, in terms of our system, they represent the president in wherever they are deployed. So that too is a process that is engaged in, and the president, in those cases, takes the final decision. But he will also have discussed it with some of the colleagues. So international organizations is even a much more complicated one, because we don't appoint people to international commissions, organizations. All we can do is to recommend. And after that, it's left to the gods, as it were.
Yes, there has been some controversy on the latter point in relation to the BRICS Bank, but we needn't go there at present. I note that the judiciary is not mentioned in paragraph 10 as one of the institutions falling within the scope of the policy. But in relation to that scope, I understand you to be saying that that scope doesn't, although very broad, and although would, in terms of its policy statement permit the deployment committee to intervene in those areas. As a matter of practice, this is not done. Is that correct? For example, the entire civil service is mentioned here.
It is not done. It is just the very top key positions, as I have said, yes.
Or perhaps a closer integration between policy and practice may be looked at.
Absolutely.
If I could take you to another paragraph on page 133, para 47. This refers to strategic centres of deployment, and paragraph 47 reads, deployment within each of the 5 pillars requires its own set of strategic discussions. For example, within the state sector, what principles should inform the deployment of cadres to institutions with judicial or investigative functions, and how should cadres deployed to perform such functions relate to the organization? There's a second point made later on, but we can come back to that. That seems to indicate that there is at least a discussion taking place in terms of the policy about judicial and investigative functions, persons deployed to those functions, and how they should relate to the organization. Firstly, are persons deployed, at least in the sense of being identified and encouraged to stand for appointment in the judiciary?
In the judiciary, no, hardly ever. Hardly ever, and I think much as it might have been thought of, it has never really resulted in that. Because the appointment of people in judiciary in our country is so well managed through the dispensation we have, through the Judicial Services Commission, which manages all these matters so well. And in the end, my full understanding is that whenever there's a vacancy, there's a lot of activity amongst the legal organizations and fraternity who encourage one another that, why don't you apply, why don't you apply, why don't you seek to be Chief Justice or whatever. So that's what I believe happens. So that one has, if any, has actually been very much light touch and not at all in as far as I know.
Would those members of the Judicial Service Commission who may be members of Parliament, ANC members of Parliament, not be expected to talk to the ANC to say, here are candidates for various positions that will be interviewed in due course? Does the ANC have preference in terms of candidates? Do you know whether anything like that does happen?
Not as far as I'm aware.
Okay.
We've always relied on just what I've set out, yes.
Okay. Mr. Pretorius?
Again, there appears to be, at least on the face of it, and you may correct me if I'm wrong, a disconnect between what the policy reads and the practice. You concede that?
Yes.
The JSC, the Judicial Services Committee, positions on the JSC, are they subject to the activities of the deployment committee?
No.
No. Then a second point is made, which doesn't necessarily relate to the first point. It says, within the, quote, economy, unquote, the potential for cadres to accumulate capital in their personal capacities is manifest. Should such capital accumulated by deployed cadres be regarded as under the command and control of the movement, and if so, how? Is that something that should be scrapped? Or what do you say about that?
No, I think this is impractical, wholly impractical. And to the extent that this may have been inserted here, it could have meant that those who may well have been put in certain positions in the economy are meant to manage those centers very well, because it's improbable that anybody, once you have accumulated capital for yourself, acting in the economy, you would then account to the organization. It never happened.
Well, it says two things. It suggests in the first sentence that there's an expectation that cadres and deployed cadres might accumulate personal wealth, whether that is in government or outside of government, it doesn't say. But the second point is that there's a thought, at least expressed here, that the policy says that, well, we should at least discuss or consider whether that money should come to the movement. Is that an appropriate clause?
No, it is wholly misplaced, because, as I say, it is improbable and could never have happened, because if people are in business, they do so in their own personal accumulation processes, and if they so want to donate money and give money to the movement, then they will be able to do so, and not that they should inherently be expected that they should, because they never would.
Paragraph 56.1 on page 135, again black number, I've just made the mistake of reading red numbers for myself. 56.1 says, cadres should be ready to be deployed where the movement deemed it necessary to deploy them. That is quite a strong statement and veers towards the hard interpretation of the deployment policy. Do you have any comment?
Well, this really should be seen in a historical context. And this is where the ANC, acting as a liberation movement, when it was banned and in exile, you were deployed wherever, and you could not question where you were deployed. And if you were, for instance, in Konto Sizwe, you would be told that you are going to be deployed on the Mozambican front or on the Lesotho front or whatever, and you go. No question asked, because you are, in the end, a soldier. And similarly, people who were not in the armed forces would be deployed anywhere. You would be deployed to London, to Moscow, wherever. And this is a remnant from that past. But today, you actually do engage in a discussion with a comrade and say, we would like to deploy you wherever. But when, as president, I appoint cabinet, I just say, this is where I want you to go. And quite often, no question asked. In fact, no question asked. People are deployed as they are informed by their upper leader. So in other situations, there are discussions because you have to take into account the circumstances of the comrade. You've got to take into account their skills base. You've got to take into account a whole number of other things. So my answer to this would be yes and no. And the no part would represent the considerations that you need to have, and the yes part, in certain deployment situations, you've got to agree to go where you are deployed.
Well, perhaps, as you've pointed out, Mr. President, in a modern and democratic economy, as opposed to the history or the historical situation in which the party found itself, perhaps it could be qualified or tightened.
Precisely, precisely.
Paragraph 60 on page 136. This is perhaps more of a commentary rather than a strict expression of policy, but it reads, the ANC's range of national and regional deployment committees ebbed and flowed over time as the movement battled intra-organization positioning, optimization of state governance, factionalism, careerism, and over the page, opportunism, desperation for employment, and the organizational dilemmas of having to act against corrupt comrades. Clearly, or perhaps I'm being presumptuous, but if I am, you will tell me so, Mr. President. Clearly, this is an expression of the problems faced, in fact, in the history of the application of the deployment policy. Am I correct in that?
Yes, you are correct. I mean, as you correctly say, Chairperson, this is commentary, and this is apt commentary, because, truth be told, we have had to deal with issues like this, the deployment committee, and as the ANC broadly, careerism, opportunism, and some of these deployments have caused internal ructions within the ANC, because we are a living organization composed of people with interests and people with aspirations and ambitions. So in the end, you've got to manage all that very, very delicately and carefully. So it is apt commentary.
Well, how would factionalism arise?
Factionalism arises because members of the organization, like it happens in any organization, would have different perspectives, different interests, and some of the perspectives may be ideological, some may be just organizational, and some may even be economic, where people have economic interests and they then cluster around those interests and become, say, a grouping within the organization and become a faction that then feeds on things that happen in the organization, be they, say, different deployments or appointments. So that then evolves into distinct groupings that could be pitted against each other. But then there could also be groupings that have a minimum sort of agenda that pulls them together. But at the other end, both ends, they have different ones, ideological, economic, or organizational.
So is it fair to say that in the history of the party, in implementing and developing the deployment policy, it has had to face particular factions seeking to further illegitimately economic interests? Is that fair?
Well, that does happen, and as any organization would attest to it, it is something that can be faced, but it really behoves on the organization whether it recognizes that as a challenge and addresses it. And I can never say that it has not affected the ANC, and it has. And it is this that we are now involved in our renewal process, that we need to rid the organization of elements, factions that pursue certain divergent interests to our broad strategic objective of advancing the interests of the people of South Africa.
And to get to the third large topic, how can it be prevented from happening again? These experiences, I understand from your evidence, inform the degree to which regulation is required.
Regulation, Chairperson, is required, regulation at the state level. But because the ANC is so broadly supported, and it is the leader of society, it has to do things not so much for its own interests, but for the interests of the people of South Africa. It therefore needs to embark on a renewal process so that it corrects all these maladies within the organization and, if you like, clean up its own act so that it is much more presentable even electorally to the people of South Africa. And I comment on this in my document that over time we saw the electoral support of the ANC going down largely because of the corrosive corruption that our people found abhorrent. And it is this, even at our 54th conference, that we sought to address, that we've got to arrest this and reverse it. And it is for that reason that we embarked on a renewal process to renew the organization. And organizations do go through these ups and downs, and that's what we've also gone through to renew our organization. But renewal should not just be in theory, it should be in practice, which is precisely where we are now. We're putting into practice the entire renewal process. And we, as it were, trying to head everyone in the same direction. And that is why I referred to the resolutions that were passed at our 54th conference were supported by thousands of members of the ANC who came from right across the length and the breadth of the country. So what remains now is the full implementation as we go forward.
Moving between categories again, not to be confusing, Mr. President, appointments to law enforcement institutions, for example, the National Director of Public Prosecutions, the Commissioner of Police, the head of Hawks, the head of IPID, SIU, and others. We know, and perhaps it could have obtained a mention, that in the appointment of the NDPP most recently, a completely new process involving public participation was directed by yourself. But let's go back to trying to understand how appointments in the past, and I'm now going before your reign, Mr. President. In the past, did the Deployment Committee involve itself in appointments to law enforcement institutions? For example, NDPP, Commissioner of Police, and the like?
No, not under my chairpersonship. No, it did not. So we didn't do so. I need, maybe on further reflection, need to maybe correct an impression I may have made when you asked me about, those who would apply to the Judicial Services Commission.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, because I do recall ones where vacancies were mentioned, and it was just in passing. I should say that it was in passing, and as it should, that the Deployment Committee would look at where are vacancies, but it never resulted or descended into saying this one would be good, that one would not be good, and so forth. And it was just in passing. So I thought I should correct that.
Okay.
But having said that, to under my chairpersonship, there was no involvement with law enforcement agencies like Commissioner of Police and DPP and so forth. It never was the case.
Right. And of course, there has also been evidence about the direct power to appoint being used for purposes that are, to put it quite plainly, illegitimate. And these appointments in law enforcement agencies and the like are the subject matter of other evidence and do not involve evidence concerning the deployment committee and will be dealt with separately. But we should not forget about those in an overview in relation to appointments to officers of state. But may I raise a further question? Because we've spoken about how the deployment committee should work, its architecture and design, as it has developed over time. We've spoken about how it might not have worked or did not work in the past in instances, and the extent of those instances may be debated. And we've spoken about the need in relation to policies and legislation, as you've stated in your statement and have spoken about now, needs to be looked at and perhaps even rewritten. But there is a view that has been expressed before the Commission, and perhaps your comment on this view would be useful, by more than one witness, and a view that's been expressed publicly, that there is no need for a deployment committee anymore. And if I may just put those views to you and then ask for your comment. In her testimony, Barbara Hogan stated, however, the usefulness of such a deployment committee these days is debatable. How can just a handful of people possibly have the institutional knowledge and resources to pronounce on suitable candidates for every senior position in government and the private sector? It cannot be that closeness to or membership of the ANC or any of its alliance structures or to factions within these structures should be the determining factors in the selection of candidates for senior positions. In this day and age, there are a host of capable black and white professionals, women and men, from which to choose who clearly understand and have an appetite for making the economy grow. Directorships on board should never be granted to the favoured few as a reward for loyalty to a party or a faction of a party, or as a retirement benefit for the well-connected. There are several items or views in that passage, and you may want to consider it at more length, but do you have any comment?
Yes, I do. Having listened to what you've referred to as put forward by former Minister Barbara Hogan, I would say that when dealing with these types of matters, it's better to be circumspect and not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Because if there is something that causes an irritation, it does not mean that you just chuck everything out. Because the deployment committee has a number of considerations that it needs to keep in mind. One of those is just having in mind the developmental nature of the state that we are creating, that we need to focus on this, what I refer to from the OECD paper, of the political aspect, which in our book would be the developmental side of the equation, where we need to keep an eye on the mandate that we've been given in terms of our own manifesto, in terms of support, because you want, let me give you a good example. You want You want, for instance, the CEO or even directors, say, of an ESCOM. You know, right in the beginning, we wanted an ESCOM to electrify the country and make sure that even our people, largely the majority black people, who never had electricity in their lives should have electricity. So that person must have a developmental as well as a commercial orientation. And if you just have someone who just has a commercial, my grandmother in Limpopo would never have had electricity because that person would just be infused or, you know, focusing on just the commercial that she will never be able to pay because she's a pensioner and da. But you want someone who you know is going to be developmental, who is going to have a very clear developmental agenda, as well as a commercial one to make sure that that happens. So in the end, it's not necessary that they should be ANC members. No. And in fact, one would discard that. The other consideration, which is very, very strong in our case, which the deployment committee oversees, is the gender balance in all these institutions. We've long gone past where we just have men appointed to various positions. So the deployment committee focuses on that and say, do we have a clear gender balance? Do we have sufficiently selected women who can get into key positions? And it is due to the deployment committee that today in government, over and over now, we have balanced boards of directors, we've balanced, even in the state, we're seeking to balance that. It's a matter of concern, for instance, to the deployment committee that the Director General cohort that we have is largely male. So the deployment committee will intervene and say to those deployed in government, you've got an overabundance of men in key positions. We need to see a balance. And so the deployment committee drives that. So that is why I would say, yes, we shouldn't just tilt the pendulum one way. It should be balanced, and it should never be because someone is close to the ANC. We should appoint people who are close to South Africa, who are South Africans, who've got the loyalty and the patriotism, but who are also professional, who we are sure have a developmental type of approach to doing things, and who would be willing to promote the ideals that the ANC, or the agenda and the mandate that the ANC was elected for. So, whilst I hear what Barbara Hogan is saying, that there's no further need, I would say that right now there's even more need. However, Employment Committee, as decided by even our recent conference, must focus on ensuring that there are people who are fit for purpose, who are professional, who know their craft, who will go and execute their craft without fear or favor, and who themselves will not be captured by any interest, who will just be there to serve the people of South Africa.
Well, I should have asked this question earlier, Mr. President. What does the deployment committee recommend? Does it recommend that a particular person be appointed to a particular position? Does it recommend that a particular person be considered for appointment to a particular position?
Chairperson, it is the latter.
It is the latter.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, it is the latter, because in the end, it has to depend on the sort of final selection processes of that given institution or given position, say, in government.
And the processes.
And the processes.
Okay.
One of the points that Barbara Hogan makes in that passage that was quoted, that perhaps there are selection committees with expertise more concentrated and more thorough to deal with selection to, for example, particular state-owned entity boards. And should it not just be left to them, I think is the statement.
Chairperson, as it often happens, it is in the end left to a selection panel that the executive authority that has been sort of deployed in that terrain will put together. For instance, I've often seen how, for instance, if a Director General has to be appointed, the Minister will make sure that the selection panel is diverse. But behind that, there is another layer that really goes into thorough details, and they often rely on external entities, where the external entities go through, in a very expert way, the identification of those people who could be appointed. But then the selection panel also has a number of, say, ministers and deputy ministers who are well versed in that sort of area. But let me also say that, you know, the deployment committee is also composed of people who are quite knowledgeable. So, you know, the deployment committee of the current period is composed of people from labor, and people from labor are usually very sharp on human resource issues. You know, yes, people from political type of organization, people from community-based organization, women, and the youth. So it's a collection of people who are so diverse in their own experiences that, in my view, gives rise to a wealth of wisdom in the recommendation of people who should be taken forward. So whoever is then taken through a number of filters and processes before they are finally appointed.
Would there be any warrant for the regulation about which you speak later on in your statement, making special provision for positions which are highly specialized, requiring specialist skills and experience? Is that catered for, or would it specifically be catered for?
It is something that we need, obviously, in accordance with what I've put forward, that we need possibly to regulate, that we should consider, because when you look at what other countries also do, some of them go through similar processes. And when we talk about the professionalization of the state with a view to increasing or enhancing the capability of the state, this is precisely what we now need to do, because we do really seriously need to ensure that capture of the state does not happen again. So we need to do things in a transparent, in a convincing way, whilst, yes, because we are a political organization, we still keep our eye on the mandate we have and ensuring that it is actually executed. So it's a wonderful balance, and as far as I'm concerned, we should really give rise to something that's quite new, innovative, and really beautiful for South Africa as we go forward.
Chair, I see it's 1:00.
Really?
Yes.
Okay. But it was 5 o'clock already.
Only 1 o'clock.
Let us take the lunch adjournment and we will resume at 2 o'clock.
Thank you.
We adjourn.